Yesterday, Trump signed an executive order that significantly advances the agenda of Project 2025 by placing control of independent regulatory agencies in the hands of the president and his loyalists. This will have far-reaching impacts on everything from the CIA to employment discrimination to free speech to whether or not major companies are held accountable for flagrant violations of the laws. His supporters say it's simply a move to bring our government back in line with the Constitution. But what the Constitution actually says about this is far more murky than they let on, and the people who stand to gain the most from this are, once more, the billionaires and oligarchs in Trump's ear. Let's get into it. Another executive order that Trump signed this week that you may have missed seeks to expand access to IVF, an issue that has been hotly contested lately. This caught my eye on The Independent, which used the headline, "Trump signs executive order to aggressively reduce IVF costs after campaign pledge to make it free." And this caught my eye because IVF has been so controversial lately, especially amongst Republicans as they've been trying to work to get rid of it. So I wanted to know more. Using the Ground News browser extension, it's helpful to see that this news source has a right-leaning bias. I genuinely love the Ground News web browser extension because I can see it while I browse news articles, and if I want to see how other sources are framing the story, I can click on full coverage. On the Ground News website, you can see that there are 147 sources covering this topic. Among them, the left publication Pink News uses the headline, "Trump signs executive order to expand IVF access so families can have more babies," while the right-leaning Town Hall frames it as, "Trump fulfills another campaign promise with latest executive order," which focuses on two different sides of the same issue, a clear example of how consuming news from only one perspective can limit your understanding of a situation. This is where Ground News comes in and why I've been using them for over a year. Today's partner, Ground News, is an app and website that offers tools to help you critically analyze the news you read, providing context to understand the full picture. By using the Ground News Vantage subscription, I can also see the blind spot feed, where I can see stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. I feel better equipped to make sense of what's happening in the world without being influenced by just one perspective. I'm always really impressed with Ground News and genuinely think that they're a great resource. So if you want to stay informed on US politics and more, scan my QR code or click the link in the description or go to ground.news/Leeja to get 40% off the same Vantage plan I use, which comes to about $5 per month. Ground News is subscriber funded, so they don't rely on ads that could introduce bias. Subscribing supports my channel and an independent team working to keep the media transparent. Thanks, Ground News. Okay, first let's get a handle on independent regulatory agencies, because that's what the order from yesterday is talking about. Unlike most agencies where there is a single director appointed by the president, independent agencies typically have a commission, board, or leadership body of 5 to 7 members. The president appoints these members and the Senate confirms, just like other agency heads, but the members serve set terms, usually 4 years, that are staggered, so there's never major turnover all at once, and there are statutory requirements that the president fill vacancies with members of both parties so that they don't come under control of whichever party happens to be in power, and they're less subject to the whims of politics. The president is only allowed to remove an independent agency head for incompetence, incapacity, neglect of duty, or other good cause. He can't just remove them willy-nilly because he doesn't like them. And obviously, that makes Trump very, very angry. Examples of independent agencies include the FEC, FCC, FTC, SEC, CIA, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, NASA, OSHA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Office of Government Ethics, Social Security Administration, and more. The order Trump signed yesterday is called Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies. It claims that independent regulatory agencies are operating unaccountable to the president and thereby unaccountable to the will of the people who elect the president. So it says now all agency heads are accountable to the president and must submit all regulatory actions that they want to take to the executive office of the president for review. The order also gives the president and the Attorney General Pam Bondi authoritative interpretation power over what the law says, saying, quote, "No employee of the executive branch acting in their official capacity may advance an interpretation of the law as the position of the United States that contravenes the president or the Attorney General's opinion on a matter of law." And this means that the attorneys at these agencies, like those at the SEC administering financial regulatory lawsuits against companies, do not get to do anything unless it perfectly aligns with Trump and Pam Bondi's official interpretations of the regulations that those very agencies have written themselves. The order applies to all independent regulatory agencies, but concerningly, it specifically mentions the Federal Election Commission. It also names the Federal Reserve, saying that the Federal Reserve's handling of monetary policy is off limits to the president, so their ability to raise or lower interest rates, for example, but all of its other functions are fair game for presidential approval. A reminder that the Federal Reserve oversees the regulations of banks and financial institutions. Independent agencies must comply within 60 days and will receive guidance from the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. That director was just confirmed, and his name is Russell Vought. Vought is also temporarily the head of the CFPB, an independent agency that protects consumers from fraud. In his role there, he has laid off employees and halted funding. Vought will also oversee performance, standards, and management objectives for all independent agency heads under this new order. Russell Vought is definitely a name you should know. He served as the OMB director at the end of Trump's last administration. He is a Republican hardliner and, according to Vox, an open Christian nationalist who founded a think tank called the Center for Renewing America. He's a proponent of radical constitutionalism, which we'll talk about more in a sec, and a central architect of Project 2025. In a video dropped by ProPublica of Vought speaking at an event put on by his think tank, Vought says, and I quote, "We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down. We want to put them in trauma." So this guy is now the director of the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees all federal agencies and administers their budgets. This new order gives the president, and through him, Russell Vought, the right to control how independent regulatory agencies spend their money and what they spend it on. And if you're thinking, wait, Leeja, I thought it was Congress who determined how federal money is spent. You'd be right. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. But under Vought and others' radical constitutionalism, that's not really what the Constitution says. They believe in what's called the presidential impoundment power, that Congress can appropriate the money, but the president can decide whether or not it's actually spent and can order agencies to not spend anything if he wants to, which doesn't make logical sense that anyone at the founding thought that that was what they were doing when giving Congress the power of the purse, that the president could just ignore what Congress says. But sure, this order is just a continuation of actions Trump has already taken against independent agencies. He's already interfered with the CFPB and the National Labor Relations Board, which handles government relations with unions and regulates against anti-union activity. Its chair, Gwen Wilcox, was fired by Trump, and she's suing to contest her dismissal. Office of Special Counsel head Hampton Dellinger was fired in a one-sentence email earlier this month, and he has also sued the Trump administration, saying his termination was illegal under the law that protects independent agency heads from removal by the president, except in cases of neglect of duty, malfeasance, or inefficiency. A D.C. judge issued an order to allow Dellinger to keep his job as the case winds its way through court. Trump appealed, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals denied Trump's request, and now it's made its way to the Supreme Court. It's the first time the Supreme Court has been given an opportunity to rule on Trump's power grab since he took office, which was somehow less than a month ago. So the central question here is about the president's removal power. Is he allowed to say who is in charge of these agencies that Congress explicitly created to be independent? Independent agencies have been part of the government for over 150 years. They grew in popularity, especially during the New Deal, which was when agency power generally expanded, and they've been the ire of conservatives ever since. Even still, the idea that the president gets to direct the activities of independent agencies goes against the accepted understanding of the Constitution as it's been understood for the 150 years since independent agencies became a thing. Now, that's not to say that the entire executive order is completely unconstitutional. According to legal experts, there is constitutional basis in the president requesting opinions from senior officials related to the duties of their offices, but giving the president the power to direct independent agency actions is against the will of Congress, the body responsible for creating the agencies. It is a separation of powers issue that Trump and his loyalists argue should fall in favor of greater concentration of power in one branch, the executive. So what do these people believe? Let's talk about the central tenet of radical constitutionalism that represents the goal of Project 2025 and what all of the chaos of the last month has been aiming towards: the unitary executive theory. What's insidious about the unitary executive theory, which I'm going to call UET for short, is that it's really easy to make it seem like it makes sense. Article 2 of the Constitution says the president is the head of the executive branch, that he must take care that all the laws be faithfully executed. Any agency Congress creates is part of the executive branch under this theory, and the president was elected by the people, so the agencies should all be answerable to the president in order to make government answerable to the will of the people. It's just what the Constitution says, they argue, and this theory has been promoted by the right since the Reagan administration at least, to try to chip away at Congress's power and at any pockets of authority that they try to create that's independent of the president. It also furthers their agenda of dismantling the deep state and the many regulatory agencies that have popped up, especially since the Great Depression, when we realized, hey, actually there should be regulations in place to protect people and stuff. Per the Wall Street Journal, Amanda Tyler, a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, said Congress turned to the independent agency structure well over a century ago to promote stability in government during a period of economic change. The idea behind independent agencies is to have insulation from the political winds, ensuring that we don't have wild volatility of policy, she said. If Trump prevails in wresting control of many of these agencies, that is the precedent in place for whoever succeeds him, potentially using that power for very different ends, she said, which indicates to me that they don't plan on having anyone in power in the future that would take the presidential power that they are concentrating and use it for, I don't know, leftist or progressive ends. The Supreme Court has 90 years of precedent that upholds the constitutionality of Congress barring the president from firing independent agency heads without cause. Trump's acting Solicitor General Sarah Harris has said that the administration plans to ask the Supreme Court to overturn that precedent. The case is called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States. William Humphrey was appointed by President Hoover to the Federal Trade Commission. Then Roosevelt came and tried to remove him for political reasons. Humphrey then died, so his executor sued to get his lost salary from the job he shouldn't have been terminated from, hence the name Humphrey's Executor. The court held that the nature of independent agencies is one of quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative powers. They set regulations, write laws, and then adjudicate those regulations. Their duties are not political or executive in nature, and therefore it was within Congress's right to limit presidential control over the independent agencies. They're not considered the, quote, arm or the eye of the executive. They do not answer to the directives of the president, they answer to the directives set forth in the congressionally written law that created them to begin with. The opinion says the power of removal here claimed for the president falls within this principle since its coercive influence threatens the independence of a commission which is not only wholly disconnected from the executive department, but which, as already fully appears, was created by Congress as a means of carrying into operation legislative and judicial powers, and as an agency of the legislative and judicial departments. There's also primary evidence around the founding of our country that indicates some of the framers believed that the president's power of removal absolutely had limits to only those who perform executive functions under the direction of the president. In Marbury versus Madison, a Supreme Court decision from 1803, one of the very first cases you read in your year one constitutional law class in law school, according to the Humphrey's Executor decision, quote, Mr. Madison quite evidently thought that since the duties of that office were not purely of an executive nature, but partook of the judiciary quality as well, a different rule in respect of executive removal might well apply. The Humphrey's opinion clearly states, quote, whether the power of the president to remove an officer shall prevail over the authority of Congress to condition the power by fixing a definite term and precluding a removal except for cause will depend upon the character of the office. There's not a blanket rule that the president controls the heads of every single agency created by Congress. It depends on what that agency does and whether it's primarily executive as opposed to legislative or judicial. Independent agencies that create regulations and adjudicate said regulations explicitly away from the influence of the president are not performing executive functions. To say otherwise oversteps the authority of Congress and throws the checks and balances system into chaos. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the CFPB structure was unconstitutional and allowed Trump to fire its director without cause. So there is precedent of this current court deciding to go along with these power grabs in contradiction to the Humphrey's Executor decision. And that's something that this court loves to do. Make up new precedent, and then a year or two later, point to the precedent they made and say, it's clearly a long-standing tradition. Look at all this precedent. None of this is normal. What presidents normally do is respect the independence of the agencies and try to avoid anything that might even make it seem like they're trying to interfere with their independence. Like, to give you an example, it was controversial when Obama urged the FCC chair to adopt net neutrality in a video that he posted online in 2014, or when the FTC chair visited Obama in the White House on the same day that Google officials were also on the premises while Google was actively under investigation. Republicans lost their shit when that happened. president. Now, Trump is like, oh no, you answer to me, and literally everything you do is now subject to my approval. This is a huge change of long-standing norms, which is, of course, the entire point. If we're going to talk about government efficiency, agencies are beneficial to the efficiency of government. By dedicating experts to the task of creating regulations around specific limited areas, it means that they know what they're doing and can do it efficiently. Unlike if it's all in the hands of the president who doesn't know jack shit about that topic area, leading to mistakes or complete deregulation, which is the point. They're trying to get rid of these regulations because that benefits businesses and moneyed interests. But complete deregulation also goes against the Constitution, which says that the president should make sure that the laws be faithfully executed. There are a lot of laws Congress has written. Running a country of 330 million people over 2.3 billion acres of land is incredibly complicated. The president can't by himself take care that the laws be faithfully executed when there are so many and it's so complex, which is why he needs agencies. Without agencies, the laws cannot be faithfully executed because there's no one there to execute them. And the president is knowingly removing experts in favor of political cronies with no understanding of what they're doing, leading to chaos, which produces waste and inefficiency. The idea of independent agencies reduces this potential for chaos by protecting from political upheaval every time a new president is electing, allowing these independent agencies to continue to regulate and adjudicate important laws as written by Congress, which allows for greater efficiency. But of course, efficiently enforcing laws against exploiting and abusing people is really inconvenient for, I don't know, someone who makes electric vehicles that sometimes spontaneously combust, for example. The main problem with all of this is that while the unitary executive theory proponents claim that the Constitution is very clear that the president controls the entire government, the Constitution doesn't actually say anything about agencies and who has power to remove agency heads. So every theory is just going off of extrapolations based on other external evidence. And so you have to also take practical considerations into account. Yes, the Constitution says that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed, but it also says Congress can make any laws necessary and proper to carrying out their constitutional powers. So would not the creation of an independent agency that isn't subject to the whim of politics be necessary and proper for the Congress to carry out their constitutional power over interstate commerce, for example? It's so much more complicated than Trump and unitary executive power proponents make it out to be. But the reality is this. There have been independent agencies for over 150 years. For the last 90 years, it has been established Supreme Court precedent that the president cannot remove heads of those independent agencies without cause. And for that same amount of time, presidents have generally respected that reality. That's all three branches of government agreeing on something. There's also the understood first principles of the Constitution, such as liberty and federalism and a separation of powers, that all stand in favor of Congress having the power to create these types of agencies. As Professor 𝗬𝗢𝗓𝗓 wrote in a 2020 Hastings Law Journal article titled The Unitary Executive Theory in Comparative Context, when comparing democratic declines in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, quote, centralization of head of state control over the executive branch of government provides a pathway to autocracy. Indeed, unilateral presidential control of the executive branch constitutes a defining characteristic of autocracy. So given the principles so important in the creation of this country and the Constitution, that of separation of powers, democracy, federalism, the ability of Congress to shield certain agencies that solely function in quasi-legislative and judicial roles from the political whims of the executive branch is very much in line with the Constitution. Despite strong arguments against the unitary executive theory, this Supreme Court seems primed to go along with this tide and overturn, at least in part, the 90-year-old Humphreys executor decision, paving the way for Trump to remove independent regulators in favor of people loyal to him. This will impact employment discrimination, workplace safety, but also the regulation of major companies, including those owned by Elon Musk, for example, because it means that the people in charge of commissions like the SEC and the rules and regulations they write and enforce will be beholden to big money and unlikely to enforce the laws Congress has written to protect all of us. Everything Trump has done in the last month has been in an effort to enact all of Project 2025, but this latest executive order is especially concerning given how important the independence of these agencies is to their ability to function and to regulate powerful actors that are hell-bent on making as much money as possible while exploiting as many people as possible. They are a line of protection for all of us that Trump and his loyalists are trying to completely do away with. And the Supreme Court might just let them. If you'd like to support my work, the #1 best way to do so is joining me over on Patreon, where you will get ad-free, uncensored access to all of these episodes. Also, I just launched the Why America Co-Learning Lab, a learning community having discussions and making connections, along with a monthly syllabus curated by me. All year, we'll be covering topics under the umbrella theme of Eat the Rich, building solidarity in the new Gilded Age. February's topic is all about how to build a movement even when you're feeling overwhelmed as hell. This is all hosted over on Patreon, which is linked down in the description, patreon.com/LeejaMiller. If you're interested, please join us. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, Thomas Orff, Sarah Shelby, Art, David, RH, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, and Tay. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. And if you liked this episode, you'll also like the one from Monday, where I talk about the dismissal of the Eric Adams case. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.